Been meaning to stream this episode for some time, but between the holidays and other things that have gone on, I never got around to it. However, in light of recently developing events, and certainly those events we, John Q. Citizen, don't have all the facts on, I figured now would be, well, maybe an opportune moment to go about and conduct this episode. For those who haven't seen either in the news or social media, the United States recently carried out a surgical strike into the nation of Venezuela and extracted the president of that nation, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife. They are set to now face charges on narco terrorism, arms possession, and a whole slew of other violations of U.S. law. Again, that is what's being reported. If you want to learn more about that, there's plenty out there, real time, that will tell you everything that has gone on, that we at least can see and know about. I'm certain that there are a lot of things that are going on behind the scenes, which we can only speculate and, frankly, could guess as to what exactly was the reason behind this incursion into a foreign nation. And the reason why I decided to do the episode today ties into that and, in a roundabout way, connects to the theme of this episode, the overall concept and or broad overview. The operation that occurred in Venezuela just yesterday is eerily reminiscent and is somewhat parallel to another operation that occurred in 1989, Operation Just Cause. During that operation, the United States Marines, SEALs, Army Rangers, and other units were deployed to the Central American nation of Panama. The goal being to depose the leader of that nation, a man by the name of Manuel Noriega, and extract him to the United States to face drug trafficking charges. Again, very similar to what's going on right now in Venezuela. And one could go back and forth over the merits of, well, the objectives in Venezuela are a lot different from Panama. After all, one could argue that the main reason why the U.S. would see itself embroiled in a conflict there, aside from the obvious, we're there to get Noriega because he's a bad guy, which is ironic in and of itself because he was actually a paid agent of the CIA during the 70s and 80s when there was conflict going on in the neighboring nations of Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. But put that to the side, the big kahuna that Panama has is the canal. French began it. They didn't necessarily succeed. The U.S. came in, built it, and has been a marvel of the world ever since. The U.S. didn't even seize possession of it. And President Trump, has recently been very bombastic about, we're going to go back and get the Panama Canal, which is yet to happen. I'm not saying it should or it shouldn't, but the most ideal time that could have occurred after the U.S., of course, surrendered it under the Carter administration to Panama was during Operation Just Cause. U.S. went in, got Noriega, mission accomplished. But they could have gone further and captured the canal. They didn't. And that was because the interests of the operation were very narrow, surgical. Could that be the same for Venezuela? Only time will tell. And that operation that was conducted in 1989 was overseen by President George H.W. Bush. He was elected following 8 years as vice president under Ronald Reagan. Reagan, of course, has a very popular image in the American psyche as somebody who restored confidence to a faltering nation, restored credibility in the United States around the world, and is lionized by many conservatives, even today, as the standard of what a good president should be. Now, the merits on Ronald Reagan as a president could fill an entire episode on its own. But the one point to examine, and again, this is sort of that roundabout way that I had mentioned earlier, was that the strike into Venezuela, strike into Panama, they were all preceded by a U.S. strike into Grenada, Operation Urgent Fury. And that operation, which took place in 1983, had the objective of securing a campus of colleges in which the students there, some American citizens, were being held under armed guard, or, well, they were basically there as hostages by a Cuban communist force that operated on the island. Certainly the pretext for that operation seemed, on the face of it, very noble. We're going down to rescue American citizens who are hostages in Grenada. Of course, nobody had ever heard of the island of Spice, probably until that point. But there's a subtle and side story to Operation Urgent Fury. And while the operation was a success, it was primarily executed as a means for the administration, the Reagan administration, to quietly distract the American public from the horrific and brutal October 1983 barracks bombing of the United States Marines in Beirut, Lebanon. And having occurred on October 23rd, it was, to that point, the single deadliest day for the United States Marine Corps since World War II. And indeed, it was a horrific day that is still remembered today, and the sacrifices made by those who perished in the rubble of Beirut are remembered. But at the time, it was taboo. It occurred, yes, we were there ostensibly for peacekeeping purposes, but it did not necessarily lead to a successful conclusion. Indeed, it was anything but victory in the generally understood sense of the word. And that's primarily because the objectives and the rules, regulations, what have you, surrounding the deployment of the Marines to Beirut was not clear-cut. It was not definitive. It was sort of like if you were to take That's a good way. It's like taking a big sort of pile of wood, dousing it with gasoline, lighting a match, and then coming along with a single cup of water. That single cup of water represented the Marines, and there was very little that they could do with that single cup of water to try and actually maintain a sort of neutral image as peacekeepers, which ostensibly was their mission. And it is, of course, no coincidence that 2 days after the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, that Operation Urgent Fury was launched. Now, again, I'm not saying that there was some grand conspiracy that occurred within the Reagan White House to try and divert attention, because after all, it was given due notice in the media and certainly has been remembered from that point forward. But one can see the coincidence, and a strange one at that, connecting the Marine Embassy bombings and Operation Urgent Fury, which again was succeeded by Operation Just Cause, which itself was succeeded recently with the operation in Venezuela, which is yet to be coined, at least to my knowledge, a unique and properly American name. At any rate, it is that topic, the Marine Embassy bombing, and the Marine barracks bombing, that will be the focus of this episode. But in order to understand why it was that the Marines were even sent there in the first place, it would be a good idea to get some context. And that being why it was that the United States Marines had to be deployed to a conflict region that was thousands of miles away from where they were. They being, of course, in the United States, and in a region that has been volatile for almost its entire history. You can go back thousands and thousands and thousands of years to see the conflicts and violence that have occurred in the Middle East region. But maybe a good starting point is the end of World War One. At the time, the Middle East was not dominated entirely, but certainly had a majority of its territory under the auspices of the Ottoman Empire. You could say that they had a controlling interest in the region. And they being the Ottoman Empire, they had been around for 400 plus years. They were an institution as it came to powers that were in the region as well as in Europe. At one point, the Ottoman Empire was actually able to compete with the best that Europe had to offer, be it the Holy Roman Empire or the Franks and the various Italian kingdoms and enterprises on the peninsula. They were a going concern for quite a while. And it was only after World War II, in which they themselves were unfortunately defeated in, that their empire collapsed. And when that collapse occurred, the spoils were divided amongst the victors. After all, history is written by the victors. And there was one specific agreement that occurred between the British and the French, who saw their interests in the region, specifically as it related to the oil in Saudi Arabia, modern day Saudi Arabia, and the Levant area along the Mediterranean coast. They, being allies during World War I, got together and agreed on what was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Now, that agreement, in brief, was a division of the Middle East as was agreed upon by the major powers that saw Britain controlling what is modern day Kuwait, parts of Saudi Arabia, parts of Iraq and Iran, having protectorates over modern day Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and parts of Egypt. The French having control of modern day Lebanon, parts of Syria, parts of modern day Turkey, and having a protectorate over modern day Syria and Iraq, areas thereof. And there was also the Russian control of what is modern day Armenia. That, to a lesser extent, was included in the agreement. And a joint British, French, and Russian protectorate / occupation of what at that time was Palestine, today is part of Israel. And of course, that in and of itself is controversial enough for an episode in its own right. But that agreement basically carved up the old Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, as it was known on the eve of World War I, and presented the spoils to the winning nations on a silver platter. And of course, they do what any colonizing power does. They go in, they set up their own administration, they make sure that they have a monopoly of violence, and they seek to systematically exploit the region and import their home to the Middle East. After a while, as is the case with any colonized people, the colonizers began to be resented. And between passive and violent resistance that was occurring against the ruling regimes, the British and the French, by this time the Russians had lost their interest after the revolution that occurred in 1917, decided to withdraw, though still keeping an active eye on events in the region. For example, in 1956, there was the Suez Crisis, which affected the Suez Canal in Egypt, and Egypt was a former colony of Britain. And while Israel was driving from the east to west, British and the French deployed to the canal as they saw it as their right as former colonizers to have control over it. And this was during the Egyptian reign of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the nationalist who sought to bring about a renewal of pride for the Egyptian people, strengthen the military, etc. So they still remained active in the region, and by rights they had reasons to be there, legitimate or otherwise. And then came, as it would inevitably throughout the region, civil war. This one in Lebanon began around 1975, and it involved militias, Palestinians, the nations of Israel, Syria, and was taken a keen interest to by the superpowers at that time during the Cold War. The United States on the one hand, and the Soviet Union on the other. And what's interesting about the chaos that occurred was that it was a fractional dispute, conflict, that was along religious and political lines. Because Lebanon was at one point French, or at the bare minimum, a French protectorate, there was an influence religiously, Christianity, Catholicism, which came from the mother country. But because it's located in the Middle East, and again, going back thousands of years now, the religion of Islam has an overwhelming effect, and a majority of the people who live in the Middle East consider themselves Muslim. So you had those two competing factions. Then you also had political disputes, and that was even within the main party that wanted to control Lebanon. So you had all these different parties, all these different factions, and then within the main faction, there was dispute. And as they tried to wrestle for control over the nation, which was slowly descending into a state of near anarchy, it could not be stopped by the central government, who themselves were extremely weak. Since they were controlled by the French, they had no history, they had no culture, they had no homegrown understanding of and or method by which they understood defending themselves. Of course, as a part of the Middle East and going back historically, there were roving bands of tribes that fought over territorial disputes, or maybe even had vendettas in the form of blood atonement, going after a specific individual who had a bounty. But the state of Lebanon, the nation itself as is understood with its own sovereign rights, did not have a tradition of defense, of an organized and competent military force. Much in the same way that South Vietnam didn't. And as a result, Lebanon was at the mercy of these warring factions. And of course, among the biggest was its neighbor in the south, Israel. Founded in 1948, from its inception, it had been constantly under the knife of its neighbors: Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, especially Egypt, and was seen as a threat to the stability of the Middle East. After all, the nation itself was to be exclusively, if not in theory, then certainly in practice, a Jewish dominated state. And it was meant to be a haven for all those Jewish refugees who found themselves after World War II citizens without a home. And the Arab and Muslim neighbors, many of whom saw the infringement upon the rights of the Palestinians as a violation of the Declaration of Human Rights that the United States, France, Britain, along with all the other Allied victors in World War II, had signed on to. And they saw it as rank hypocrisy. Moreover, they saw their own interests threatened. At the end of the day, human nature is generally the deciding factor on a lot of decisions that are made between nations or individuals. And of course, the Arab nations saw their own self interests threatened by a non Muslim majority state in the region. And by 1982, which is when Israel really started to make a move against Lebanon, the Jewish state had proved its resilience and its pluck in being able to defeat a series of attacks against itself, literally from the day it was created as a nation. And they themselves wanted to go into Lebanon in order to remove the threat that the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, led by a charismatic figure named Yasser Arafat, was constituting against Israel, launching rocket attacks and just conducting terrorist raids that originated in Lebanon against Israel. And that invasion took place in June of 1982. And it was that event, more than any else, that was the crucible in which the United States sought to intervene as peacekeepers. And they certainly weren't the only nation to do so. The French, pretty obviously, United Kingdom, again for obvious reasons, and Italy were the main drivers behind the multinational force that was deployed. So with that being said, a very speed run course in history, no doubt. Let's get into the book in which, through it, a lens will be created to examine this overall theme, that being the U.S. Marines in Lebanon in 1982 and 1983. And the book is titled When Reagan Sent in the Marines by Patrick Sloan. And Sloan is he died recently, but he was a very prominent and respected journalist, writer, and with this work, an amateur historian, although certainly his methods were anything but amateurist. And he talks about the context that I just mentioned, as well as other factors that then lead into how the Marines found themselves deployed in Lebanon. And he mentions in more detail the factionalism that existed within Lebanon and how the major players in the region were able to utilize that to their advantage. Syrians certainly did, as did the Israelis. And he discusses how the idea of utilizing those factions could ultimately benefit the interests of the nations who saw what could be done in Lebanon for their own benefit. And he writes, quote, "The Mideast version of this story involved three cadaverous Christian leaders, Bashir, Gamaleh, Camille, Kamon, Suleimani, Frangia, clinging to the mountain rocks of Lebanon. Facing certain death from surrounding Arab enemies, they sang to the Jews of Israel, 'Come form a coalition with Jews and Maronite Christians that will rule the Levant.' David Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister of Israel, was lured by the song from Lebanon's minority sect. So was his one-eyed general, Moshe Dayan," quoting Ben-Gurion. "A Jewish-Christian front in the Arab Ocean," Ben-Gurion proclaimed. They would buy a Christian leader who, in turn, would invite Israel to Beirut. And soon the Druze, the Shiites, and the Sunnis, the Islamic majority, would be under a Jewish Christian thumb. End quote. Sloan continues, quote, however, Israeli Foreign Minister Moshe Sharat delivered stinging face slaps to Ben-Gurion and Dayan. A vain fantasy, Sharat lectured. We'll get bogged down in a mad adventure that will only bring us disgrace. In Arab Lebanon, no Christian dare embrace Israel or be a genuine ally, he said. Ben-Gurion backed off. Sharat knew the Christian leaders for what they were, men without character or integrity, scrambling to survive by sheer guile and the incompetence of Arab enemies. Despicable was how Egyptian President Anwar Sadat branded Christian leadership. Ceasefires and peace agreements, even within the Christian community, were broken at the first opportunity to destroy neighboring families. Many massacres of Arab villages or communal bloodbaths somehow involved Christian knives. End quote. So just to unpack this, because there's a lot that was mentioned that may not be very straightforward. It certainly isn't to me. But from what I could ascertain, and again, as you notice, trying to pronounce these names is going to be quite the challenge, so I do apologize, and please bear with me. But the Prime Minister and the highest ranking and certainly most respected general within Israel saw the possibility for expanding the net of their security in the region by taking advantage of the factionalism and aligning themselves with that faction that was most similar to them. There was not much compatibility with respect to Muslims, certainly when Muslim majority nations had made it their goal to destroy Israel and wipe it off the map. Christians, on the other hand, while certainly an odd couple, no doubt, would be a little more pliable for the goals in which Israel sought to attain. And that was what you could say the origins or the aegis for Israel seeing potential in invading southern Lebanon. But the Christians themselves were not Christians in the generally understood sense of the word. And they certainly, by and large, were not practicing. And that was because if you're a Christian in the Middle East, you are born, and again, this is sort of a broad stereotype, but you're born with a cross in one hand and a 9mm in the other. And you're pretty much from birth trained and educated to look out and defend yourself. And if anything, the Christians were just utilizing that front, that holier than thou image, to cover for their scheming, their conning, their cleverness, and to benefit from the support that would inevitably come from Israel, which in some form or another would possibly include the United States, since one of Israel's biggest benefactors was the United States, and still is true today. So they saw the opportunities for potential advancement limitless. And with the cash and credit of the United States down the road, but certainly Israel up front, they thought, why not? And the phalangists, being the Christian militia political organization that was against the PLO and in constant conflict, as well as with the Druze, spelled Druze, they were in constant battle, massacring Arab villages, going in the middle of the night, raping them, and making a very negative sort of name and reputation for themselves. And that, of course, only fueled resentment that trickled down along religious and political lines. And it would ultimately be that with which would be used as a pretext for later on United States, but certainly in the immediate future, Israeli intervention in Lebanon, as well as to combat the PLO. And when the Israelis ultimately invaded in June 1982, they met very little resistance and were able to get to Beirut and put the city under siege. And it was a very brutal siege. Because when you think of sieges, you tend to get images of a fortress surrounded on all sides by the enemy with their siege weapons and cannons and hordes of men and limitless resources, while inside the besieged city, fortress, town, what have you, their supplies, their manpower, their weapons were dwindling. And one could argue, I mean, yes, there's Stalingrad, but that wasn't necessarily a siege more so than it was a running battle. There was also Budapest and Berlin, but those weren't on the ground camera recorded sieges. It was propaganda, or it was newsreels, or it was heavily edited and redacted in order to give whomever watched it the image that the creators intended. But it was really the first major international siege of a civilian city, and certainly a civilian capital, broadcasted on live television. And certainly it wasn't the first time that the U.S. found itself embroiled in a siege on live television. That happened during the Vietnam War at Khe Sanh, but that was a military base, strictly for military purposes, and the majority of those on the base were military personnel. In Beirut, it was just the opposite. Majority civilians, many women, children, elderly, and of course you had PLO and other militias in the city itself. But the imagery that was coming out of it, newsreels and the reports and the heavy shelling that was seen on television and the cutting off of the water supply, which, from the standpoint of siege tactics, is very brilliant, but it wins you very little friends on the international stage. All those things culminating together created one inevitable outcome, and that was anger and resentment against what was seen by the region as unchecked, uncontrolled, and unprovoked aggression by Israel in attacking southern Lebanon and besieging Beirut, and witting accomplice to the slaughter, and certainly very willing at that, in the form of the United States. And this was noted in Sloan's book by a quote from a young engineering student, Saudi Arabian, named Osama bin Laden, who we in the modern world know him as the leader of Al Qaeda. But at the time, he was a simple college student looking to maybe continue the success of his family's wealthy construction business. But upon seeing what was going on in Lebanon and being able to observe the connection though not direct, but certainly clear in his mind between the aggressors on the ground and the aggressors abroad, he was able to very poignantly state possibly what the rest of the Muslim Middle East felt by this incursion into Lebanon by Israel. And he is quoted by Sloyan as saying, quote, "After the situation became unbearable and we witnessed the injustice and tyranny of the American-Israeli alliance against our people in Palestine and Lebanon, I thought about it. And the events that affected me directly were those of 1982 and the events that followed, when America allowed the Israelis to invade Lebanon, helped by the U.S. Sixth Fleet. As I watched the destroyed towers in Lebanon, it occurred to me to punish the unjust the same way, to destroy towers in America so it could taste some of what we were tasting, and to stop killing our women and children." End quote. Now, this is from an interview in 2004, after 9/11 had occurred and after everyone knew the name of Osama bin Laden. So, take it with a grain of salt that maybe what he's saying is a little disingenuous because it's after the attack occurred, and certainly after the United States did get a taste of the medicine that he was talking about. But if what he said was indeed truthful and was not in any way a propaganda motive or had any other ulterior motives, it is without a doubt concerning that the Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon was seen as nothing more than a U.S. proxy fight, and that view accelerated the radicalism of not just himself, but the other Arab and Muslim in the Middle East to attack really anything that was associated with or was having to do with the United States in any way, shape, or form, for whatever the reasons that they were there. For example, if there was a peacekeeping mission there, they didn't see it as such. They saw it as aggression on their soil, and the only way to remove aggression was through force. So they being the individuals who opposed the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and certainly the multinational force that followed thereafter, were not going to go gently into that good night. They weren't going to allow, as they saw it, their home, their nation, their culture be trampled upon by foreigners. Nevertheless, the Marines that were part of that multinational force were deployed not as a combat force, but as peacekeepers. And their main mission was to oversee the evacuation of the PLO from Beirut, which was one of the main goals that Israel had when they invaded southern Lebanon, and a condition for lifting its siege. Support the Lebanese government, or whatever it was that existed there, and to help stabilize the situation so eventually the multinational force could withdraw. And eventually they did withdraw. They were able to succeed in their initial mission in 1982, yet they had to be redeployed again in 1982 after the assassination of the president-elect Bashir Gemalin. And he had been mentioned previously, and he was sort of this fast-talking, smooth, slick cat that really was able to get to where he was only by sheer luck and shrewdness. Ultimately, that luck would run out. And when they were redeployed, they took a more active approach in dealing with the situation. They certainly had to. It wasn't their intention, they didn't want to, but they had no other choice. After all, if you're being attacked by rockets and mortars from the hills and you're taking casualties, rules of engagements are pretty clear, and you must fire back, certainly to prevent further loss of life, that being unnecessary loss of life. And it should be noted that this wasn't the first time that the Marines were deployed to Beirut. They were there in the 50s as well, under similar pretext, but not to the same degree. And that incursion was more successful. Certainly, the final tally in killed, wounded, missing certainly showed that the effort that occurred in the 1950s was much more worthwhile and in keeping with the traditions of the Marine Corps, orderly, proficient, and peaceful. And this time around, the Marines were seen as less neutral by all the competing factions when their goal was just to remain neutral of arbiters as possible. And as I had mentioned, the various factions in Lebanon that were now opposing the U.S.-Israeli alliance in their home country began to go after American institutions, American citizens, units. There was kidnappings, there was ambushes. And one of the more brutal precursors to what inevitably would occur on that fateful day in October 1983 was the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Beirut. And that occurred on April 18th, 1983. And Sloan was able to get the perspective of the bombing from the ambassador, Robert Dillon. And he was able to talk about what it was like for him, the man tasked with keeping good relations with the nation in Lebanon, whomever was the leader in the ruling party at the time, and by being President Reagan's point man in the capital of Beirut. And Sloan quotes Dillon as saying that this was what it was like when the embassy was attacked. Quote, "All of a sudden, the window blew in. I was very lucky because I had my arm in the t-shirt in front of my face, which protected me from the flying glass. I ended up flat on my back. I never heard the explosion. Others said that it was the loudest explosion they ever heard. It was heard from a long distance away. As I lay on the floor on my back, the brick wall behind my desk blew out. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The wall fell on my legs. I could not feel them. I thought they were gone. The office filled with smoke, dust, and tear gas. What happened was that the blast first blew in the window and then traveled up an air shaft from the first floor. The blast then set off so that the air rush that came up through the shaft brought the tear gas with it and also collapsed the wall. We didn't know what had happened. The central stairway was gone, but the building had other stairway at which we used to make our way down, picking our way through the rubble. We were astonished to see the damage below us. I didn't realize that the entire bay of the building below my office had been destroyed. I hadn't grasped that yet. I remember speculating that some people had undoubtedly been hurt. As we descended, we saw people hurt. Everybody had this funny white look because they were all covered in dust. They were staggering around. We got to the second floor, still not fully cognizant of how bad it was, although I recognized that major damage had been done. With each sound, the magnitude of the explosion became clearer. I saw Marlene McGinty standing. She couldn't see because her face had been cut and her eyes were full of blood. I picked her up and took her over to a window and gave her to someone. End quote. Sort of a real harrowing brush with death, especially for somebody who is not a military official. Of course, they interact with the military and they're involved in some way, shape, or form with coordinating civil military relations within Lebanon, but they're primarily bureaucrats, forces of the political structure and the regime that existed at that time in the United States. So for them to be targeted, while certainly not out of the realm of possibility, was eye-raising, to say the least. And the result of that deadly embassy attack was 17 Americans being killed, and this going on in the midst of the siege showed that Americans were now being targeted. And this ostensibly forced Reagan to deploy the 24th Marine Amphibious Unit, the MAU, which would go and would relieve the current Marine force that was there, which had to be redeployed after the assassination of Gemelli. And on the face of it, it's an interesting choice that Marines are sent to do peacekeeping work. After all, Marines are considered, at least in the United States, as the most aggressive, high-charging, and bloodthirsty of the major branches of the military. Not bloodthirsty in the sense that they go out and scalp or butcher whomever it is they come across. This is no Genghis Khan we're talking about. But they have a reputation for being first to fight and being the toughest ones to fight. So for them to then have the moniker of peacekeeper placed on them is sort of an oxymoron. It's like giving a serial killer children to babysit. That's a very extreme comparison, but obviously that's one way to look at it. And it's certainly one way that the Marines maybe not necessarily felt about themselves, but they were even a bit confused as to why they were being sent when maybe another force would have done better. And they probably wished, looking back, they hadn't been deployed in the first place. Nevertheless, they were sent, and they went where they were told to. But when they got there, it was not the greatest circumstance that they found themselves in. And that was because they were thrusted into a fastly descending series of unfortunate events that would lead into utter chaos. Unlike in 1982, when the Marines were deployed, they did their job, and then they withdrew, the Marines now faced active resistance, and they were not seen as those neutral forces which they had supposed to be, which is what their goal was. The people within Lebanon did not view them as such. They saw them as just another faction, a foreign one at that, with the goal of ultimately upending their culture, their way of life, and they didn't take too kindly to that. And especially where they were Marines, with that reputation, they weren't going to have any of it. And Sloan describes what it was like for the Marines who were deployed in Beirut, what they went through, and what they found themselves in, because it certainly wasn't a black and white affair. For military servicemen and women, you want it to be as clear cut as possible. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. We have to attack this position, secure this town, make sure that this objective is held. The more complicated it gets, the more controversial it becomes. Not necessarily controversial for the individuals involved, but more so for factors outside of the control of the unit that is sent. Once you get past the black and white and enter the big gray area where politics inserts itself, you then have an issue where a force that sees itself as a hammer is unsure as to whether or not everything they see is a nail and whether or not they can hit that nail, as hammers are designed to do. And Sloan describes what it was like for the Marines on the ground when they were in Beirut. And he writes, quote, "The Marines were deployed on the worst possible low ground around Beirut International Airport. To keep Israeli forces away from Lebanon's only airport, the U.S. Embassy rejected pleas from at least 3 commanders for a base for higher ground. To the Marines' backs were airport runways and then the shore of the blue Mediterranean. The Marines were sitting ducks for artillery, rocket, mortar, and sniper fire from the looming Shuf Mountains. Their mission was to be a neutral buffer between factions with unsettled ancient vendettas. Garrity, that is Colonel Timothy Garrity, the commander, limited his infantry to a self-defense condition 4, no bullets in rifle chambers. Withhold fire unless directly threatened. The rules of engagement were becoming meaningless. Peacekeeping had become a bloody joke. Garrity was restricting the use of his artillery and mortars to tit for tat. Fire on the Marines, and after a warning, the Marines will shoot back. But he was determined to avoid using offshore fighter bombers and warship guns that could destroy everything in the mountains above. The Marines were under attack by different Arab factions. Ragheads, his Marines called them. On that day, September 8th, 1983, Garrity was being bombarded by Shiite Muslims who wore the lacy, filigreed white skullcaps of the Druze mountain tribe. For 100 years, the Druze exchanged massacres with the Maronite Christians, and the blood feud was underway once more. The Druze leader, the Bey, was Walid Jumblat. In leather jacket, boots, and blue jeans, Jumblat prowled the mountain battlefield aboard a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Once inside Christian mountain villages that day, the Druze favored knives for the slaughter. The Christian leader was Amen Gemallah, who had replaced his assassinated brother Bashar as president of Lebanon. That title and pressure from Israel resulted in U.S. political and military support for Gemal's Christians. Confident support from American warships in Beirut harbor, Gemal's Christian militia had initiated attacks on Jumblat and his Druze mountain villages a week earlier. Almost every Shuf village had an outdoor restaurant where blue smoke from the grill mixed with the perfume of cedars and eucalyptus. Now, many smelled of cordite and blood. While Garrity tried to cling to his role as an even-handed, independent, and neutral peacekeeper, Walid Jumblat saw the Marines as part and parcel of the Christian attacks that fell on Druze villages in the Shuf Mountains and overlooked Beirut. Jumblat's artillery and ammunition bombarding the Marines came by mountain road from Syria and its astute president, Hafez al-Assad. Assad had just been rearmed by his military patron, the Soviet Union, and the Syrian leader was in league with Iran's Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the black-eyed Shia leader of extremist Islam. Who was the enemy? Iran, Soviet Union, Syria, Jumblat. There was even a splinter of the Palestine Liberation Organization taking pot shots at Marines. It was a lethal mix. End quote. Again, you see that last sentence or two is the gray area. Who's the enemy? Is it the PLO guys? Is it the Druze militiamen? Is it Syria? Is it the Soviet Union? Who is it? And it's that uncertainty as to who it is that their lethality should be directed towards, coupled with the increasing levels of discomfort caused by the attacks that were occurring daily against the Marines at the airport, that made the situation as a whole very unnerving and very displeasing to those Marines who were there in Lebanon. And as mentioned, they were led by a colonel named Timothy Garrity. And he was, for lack of a better word, a warrior in every sense of the word. He had led a reconnaissance company in Vietnam, and as a lieutenant colonel, he was on special assignment with the CIA's Special Operations Group. Suffice to say, he knew what it was like to be in the thick of hot and heavy battle, and he could smell a fight when it was right around the corner. And he knew that the position his Marines were in was untenable. They were trying to be neutral. They were trying to do all the right things, follow the rules of engagements, live up to their reputation as peacekeepers first, given the setting. Of course, their reputation as Marines preceded itself, but trying to reinforce that image and reputation of being peacekeepers, while also minimizing the loss of life that could occur to his men. And as the date that this attack occurred indicates, it's a month and a half before the inevitable, that being the barracks bombing of Garrity's command. And of course, Garrity would have much rather preferred to be in some jungle or desert region leading special forces unit or a group with special operations connotations, but here he was commanding the 24th Marine Amphibious Unit. And it was that unit in its barracks at the airport in Beirut that was the target of all those factions that were against the United States. And they themselves were attacked very violently, very brutally, very viciously on Sunday, October 23rd, 1983, early in the morning when many of them were still sleeping in their bunks, or for those who were on guard duty, were just beginning to see the glimpse and the rays of the sun coming up over the horizon. And what had happened was a truck filled, it was a yellow Mercedes truck, filled with TNT, explosives, dynamite. It was actually the largest non-nuclear explosion to that point that occurred. And it was, well, there's really no other way to put it but a slaughter. The truck drove right in to the barracks building and it detonated. And when it did, it killed 241 U.S. servicemen. And among the scores of dead, it included 220 Marines. Now, those Marines that were killed, they didn't know what hit them. They didn't know what happened. It was instantaneous. It was sudden. And it was unfortunately not the way that a lot of them would have wanted to go out. Sleeping in their beds without a chance to properly shoot back at the enemy. And it was the worst loss of life, single day for the worst loss of life for the Marine Corps since Iwo Jima in World War II. And the images that came out of that explosion and that attack are some of the most harrowing and brutal and saddening that one could see. And it makes you wonder that all those Marines who were killed and other servicemen, it's not exclusive to just Marines. There were Navy corpsmen and Army soldiers and Air Force forward air controllers. But all of those men that were killed by those 6 tons of TNT, each one of those 241 is more than just a note in a ledger. It's an individual, a human being whose life was taken in an instant and who would not be able to live into the winter years of their life. And again, though they were Marines and though they had a reputation, halls of Montezuma, shores of Tripoli, their mission was strictly peacekeeping. Nothing more, nothing less. And they found themselves in a position where they could no longer control the events. They just did what they could to survive. And it didn't help that they were not given the, you could say, adequate enthusiasm and confidence that is usually afforded to a unit of this size, given its location and difficult mission, because 2 days later, the attention was shifted to Grenada. But in the midst of the tragedy and the destruction that was all around not only the Americans, but also Lebanese and other nationalities, there was a glimmer of hope, and that was captured by Sloan as he's able to intermix the terrible destruction of the bombing and the silver lining that came through that dark cloud that was hovering over the rubble. And Sloan describes it as the following, quote, Colonel Timothy Garrity, still ankle deep in his slaughtered Beirut command, was surprised at the arrival of the president. Francis Mitterrand had come with France's condolences. At almost the same moment, 241 Americans were killed on that Sunday morning of October 23, 1983. Another truck bomb struck the French headquarters. It killed 58 French soldiers and wounded scores. First thing Monday, Mitterrand flew to Beirut. These were his troops. He had sent them into harm's way. They were part of an American-commanded multinational force, and he had supported its mission. Once he attended to the French troops, Mitterrand rode to the nearby American compound. A 40-foot concrete and steel barracks was now a hole full of broken slabs, crushing moaning Marines. Smells of feces, blood, and sun-ripened flesh hung in the air. Pieces of Marines were still being recovered. A Marine in a sleeping bag was impaled on a tree limb. Such a walkthrough would be enough for any other visiting head of state. Not Mitterrand. He proceeded to a nearby Lebanese Air Force hangar that had become a makeshift morgue for Garrity's dead. It was dark inside, where almost 200 bodies in green body bags had been placed in aluminum containers called transfer cases. Many of the body bags contained only body parts. The transfer cases were stacked 4 wide and 4 high on aluminum pallets. There were 16 transfer cases on each pallet, secured by nylon straps. The rows of pallets seemed endless. It took a moment for Mitterrand's eyes to adjust to the darkness. He was astonished. Quoting Garrity, his eyes opened wide and his face became pallid, Garrity said. It was an expression that I will take to my grave. In a classic Gallic gesture, Mitterrand raised both hands and palms skyward. He implored heaven for an answer to the enormity of so many young men in tragic death. Before each stacked pallet, Mitterrand made a sign of the cross and said a silent prayer. When he was done, Mitterrand asked to inspect a floodlit area blocked by curtains in the back of the hangar. Inside, bits and pieces of Marines were being assembled in body bags. Quoting Garrity again. Again, Mitterrand and his party paid their solemn respects to the fallen peacekeepers, Garrity said. It convinced me that the French will stand with us in times of bad fortune. 6 Marines had yet to die. They were being crushed between concrete slabs too big to be removed in time. Navy corpsmen injected morphine as they slipped away. End quote. Very powerful scene that Sloan describes. And it's even more powerful given the fact that it was the president of another country that came and showed support. Of course, Vice President George H.W. Bush would go to Beirut and survey the damage himself, but it was a really touching tribute to the joint U.S.-French cooperative alliance. The first major one, it shall be noted, between the newly created United States and a foreign power following its revolution and independence, and one that is, as Gary poignantly noted, lasted throughout time. Moreover, it demonstrated that while the American public and American government may have forgot about them and had focused now on Grenada, their sacrifices, their contribution, and the duty to uphold their mission as best they could did not go unnoticed. And certainly Mitterrand was there to show just that. Can't be said whether it improved morale or made a difference, as I'm sure most Marines didn't recognize the president when he was there. But it nevertheless signaled that when a force of this disposition comes in peace with the goal of maintaining neutrality, they will win far more battles than if they are an aggressive and armed combatant. Eventually, the American government did act. By early 1984, the Marines were withdrawn from Lebanon. And that sad and tragic chapter was finally closed on the entire affair. Though, of course, those who were there and who witnessed it, and even those who were related to those who were there, remember what it was like and know that it was something that ought never to be forgotten again. And it certainly is poignant and relevant now that such touching shows of comradeship, emphasizing the importance of peacekeepers, while also recognizing tragedy and horror that come from such missions and operations, are something more than just directives and operational orders. It's the moving around and changing of the fates of individual human beings. And as I stated at the beginning of the episode, with the United States making waves in its own hemisphere and looking to go about and secure its interests as it sees fit, one can only hope that a repetition of October 23rd, 1983 is not in the cards for the future. And let the legacy and memory of those 241 Americans and 58 French soldiers as well be a reminder of the cost of what happens when you send the best a nation has to offer away from its shores on a mission that could be without end, without a clear objective, and certainly without having and keeping with the best of intentions and traditions of a democratic and free society.